Close to a path, high up in the cemetery, there's an unusual grave. Passers-by over the years must have wondered who's buried here, because unlike most other graves in the cemetery, the stone hasn't got a name on it. There are some initials, MB, a date of death, 2 quotations from the Bible, and there's some enigmatic lettering at the foot of the grave. Her mourners never expected to have to bury her. They thought she was going to live forever. But she did die. Her companions left it 3 days before they decided to call the undertakers. In the meantime, they kept watch over the body day and night. They tried to revive her using blankets, hot water bottles, brandy, and even what they considered to be miraculous holy water. But in the end, they had to give up. Her name was Mabel Baltrop, and although few people would recognise her name, many older Bedfordians will remember tales and rumours about the organisation she founded. She was responsible for a secretive religious society called the Panacea Society, with followers all over the world. They believed that she was a great prophet and even the daughter of God. Her grave was restored in 2015 thanks to work carried out by volunteers from the Friends of Bedford Cemetery and the Panacea Museum. In all, we discovered that over 100 of her followers are buried in the cemetery, with at least 16 having some kind of stone still standing. The Panacea Society was set up just after the Great War of 1914 to 18. Early members were mainly middle-class Edwardian ladies with an intense interest in religion. They believed that the millennium was imminent, a time for Christ to return to earth, ridding the world of pain, evil and unhappiness. Some were former suffragettes. There were men as well, often former military men who had been traumatised in the Great War. They became convinced that their leader was a great prophet called Shiloh. They renamed her Octavia, being the 8th prophet of modern times. Followers moved to Bedford, often buying houses in the embankment area. They formed a community, keeping themselves to themselves, trying to prepare for the millennium by a process called overcoming, ridding themselves of their faults. Its heyday was in the 1920s and 30s, when there were over 70 members living in Bedford and followers all over the world, especially in the old British Empire. Most of the Panaceans are buried in this part of the cemetery, near to the Soldiers' Memorial. Most are unmarked, and none of those that do have some kind of a stone make any reference at all to the Panacea Society. So in death, just like in life, they were secretive. Although secretive, they could be headline news. Right up until the 1980s, they were campaigning for the opening of a box of sealed writings. These writings were by a previous prophet called Joanna Southcott. The box had to be opened in a specially prepared house in Newnham Road, Bedford, and in the presence of 24 bishops of the Church of England. They campaigned rigorously for this. Petitions were organised. Thousands upon thousands of leaflets were handed out. There were full-page adverts in national newspapers. Unfortunately, no Archbishop of Canterbury agreed to this. The box is still held in Bedford and has never been opened. They also had what they called a healing mission. In all, about 130,000 people from all over the world applied for their method of healing by the use of water and these small pieces of fabric. Octavia had breathed on these to make them blessed. Over 41,000 people from the West Indies alone applied, and amazingly, requests were still being received and actioned 70 years after Octavia died. So perhaps for some people it did work. Nowadays we might consider them to be rather strange and even vulnerable people. Some of them undoubtedly had mental problems. They believed that Bedford was the centre of the original Garden of Eden. They needed help and support in many instances, and they got that help and understanding in the community where they lived. And in Octavia, they had a charismatic leader in whom they believed. so it was quite a shock to them when she died. But the very first Panacean to die, in 1921, was Ellen Oliver. She was a former suffragette, and in fact had once been put into Holloway Prison for her activism. She's buried here in the posh bit of the cemetery, just below the chapel, amongst all the great and the good of Bedford. The early Panaceans in particular really knew their Bible, and the inscription on Ellen's grave is well chosen. There were lightnings and thunderings and an earthquake, indicating that the day of revelation wasn't far away, but it didn't quite work out like that. Octavia's 3 sons all died abroad, but her daughter, Dilys, was buried here in 1969, just a few yards away from her mother. Dilys had a sad life, never really having had the chance to move away or to get married. Her grave is unmarked, so just as with her mother, nobody would know who is buried here. In 2012, Ruth Klein, the last Panacean, died. She's buried in the woodland section in North Road Cemetery. It's only in very recent years that we've found out very much about the Panacea Society, because it was secretive, and research is still being carried out. But what we do know is that Bedford was once the centre of a remarkable religious community, perhaps even the site of the Garden of Eden. And Bedford Cemetery, well, we've got Octavia, a very English kind of a Messiah.